We have brought in a real heavyweight, super interesting career, NASA, White House Office of Management and Budget, CFO of the Department of Energy, Virgin Galactic, and then went on to raise a cool $1 billion and then joined Aerospace Corp. Do you think space as a commercial sector is going to be real?
It absolutely is a real thing. The problem in space is it's an incredibly harsh environment. It was always assumed that this tech was so hard, only the government can do it. Now here comes these new companies who saying, I don't think it's that hard. I think we can do it. That changes everything. A lot of the focus today in national security is on this word resilience. And that's where I think commercial has gotten much more interesting. We probably do more things across America's space program than even the federal government does. We say at the Aerospace Corporation that grounds the new space. The amount of data we bring down now is just overwhelming. You got these traditional sort of hardware-first companies versus more of these services companies that are coming at it with this sort of software-first approach. That's what's kind of the interesting tussle right now. You didn't ask me a question I thought people always ask me in these interviews. Is there intelligent life elsewhere? And why haven't you told us by now?
I would love to hear what data you have on that.
Welcome to SOSV Deep Tech Live, where we explore the frontiers of deep tech with the world's top technologists, founders, and researchers. Our moderators are the general partners of SOSV, the first check in deep tech, a venture dedicated to human and planetary health. In this episode, startups, space, and boundless frontiers. SOSV General Partner Pae Wu explores the rapidly evolving world of space innovation with Steve Isakowitz, CEO of the Aerospace Corporation, a leading architect for the nation's space programs, operating in the civil, national security, and commercial realms. Isakowitz shares his unique perspectives on the unparalleled demands of space tech, the rapid evolution in the category where startups are breaking barriers, whether the future of space innovation will depend more on software than hardware, how asymmetric technologies and commercial space are reshaping global conflicts, and where the next massive opportunities for space startups will be. From billion-dollar government contracts to Silicon Valley startups rewriting the rules, this episode reveals how the new space race is reshaping innovation, national security, and our daily lives on Earth.
Thank you for being here on this beautiful day. I'm excited to welcome y'all here to IndieBio New York's Biome. I'm Pae Wu. I'm one of the general partners here at SOSV. I'm actually based out of our IndieBio San Francisco office, but today I'm coming at you live from New York, and I'm really excited to be here today. This is our second installment, and we have brought in a real heavyweight. You know, we do deep tech here at SOSV. We're mostly known for doing deep tech that's in service to human health, planetary health, and industrial independence. But tonight, we are going to be talking about exoplanetary health. And we have a very accomplished and experienced individual in this space of space tech, Steve Isakowitz. Thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Delighted to be here.
Steve is the CEO of Aerospace Corp. Aerospace Corp is a federally funded research and development corporation, so FFRDC for short. And your role is to help the U.S. government in its space mission. And you work with lots of different government entities. See, there's a line on your website. I'm going to read it. The leading architect for the nation's space programs, advancing capabilities that outpace threats to the country's national security while nurturing innovative technologies to further a new era of space commercialization and exploration. We're going to take some time to dive into what exactly that means. But first, let's welcome Steve Isakowitz, please.
Great. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to do something embarrassing and talk a little bit about your background. I hope you can live with that.
Okay. I can live with it. Depends what you say, though.
So,
You haven't talked to my sister or anything, have you? Okay.
No, if I had
All right.
known, I would have
Then
called her.
Then I'm okay.
Steve is a two-time MIT grad in aerospace engineering and has had a super interesting career spanning, let's see, NASA, the White House Office of Management and Budget, OMB. You were the CFO of the Department of Energy. And then you moved over to Virgin Galactic, this commercial space entity, and then went on to raise a cool $1 billion for that company. And then shortly thereafter joined Aerospace Corp. So you've really been, I think, at the forefront of what it means to bring capital
Mhm.
into space. I'd love to talk to you about what this whole thing of commercial
Mhm.
space even is. So I'm going to start with a question for you.
Okay.
Some people have said that you're a space nerd. Is that true?
True. 100%.
So you studied aerospace engineering at
Mhm.
MIT. Did you intend to go into government after that? Was that the only path, or was
Yeah.
commercial space even a thing that was kind of the twinkle in your eye?
Yeah, for me, you really gotta start with elementary school.
Okay.
All right. So I'm gonna ask the audience here. I saw a movie that actually had a big impact on me, but it might also show my age. 2001: Space Odyssey. All right, raise your hands. All right, awesome. Amazing special effects. That movie had so much going for it in terms of not only the realism, but they really captured the physics of space
Oh yeah.
travel. And by the way, it's probably the first movie that probably did pretty interesting job on the first AI, HAL 9000. So for those of you who haven't seen the movie, this is a must see. But there's a scene in there that really caught my attention. I thought that is cool. And that was this individual who's the hero of the movie. He gets inside of a space line. It's a Pan Am, which is at that time was a commercial airlines that was running a space line between the Earth and the Moon. And he's sitting there like any other passenger, and they're floating around and being served food. And for somehow that just like caught my imagination. I'm like, that's the future. And literally between that and of course the Apollo program that was going on at the same time, I knew that I got the bug.
Yeah.
I was a space nerd.
That's awesome. I think it's incredible to think about how important mass media is
Mhm.
in helping to bring that imagination to kids,
Yes,
and can lead to these like long outcomes that are
absolutely.
incredible. I mean, God, like to go from a little kid watching the Pan Am space airline to running Virgin Galactic. How does that even, were there times when you were running Virgin Galactic that you were
Yes, and I was thinking to myself, "Why haven't we gotten to the moon yet?" Yes, absolutely. Come on, guys, we gotta work a little harder here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a hard thing that we're doing.
It is very hard, yeah.
Um, so okay, I think your career is so interesting in part
Mhm,
because you were at OMB, the Office
mhm,
of Management and Budget, which no shade, but it's kind of the bean counters of
mhm.
the government. And then you ended up at a place that was really, yeah, at the
Yeah,
forefront of innovation in space. Like how did you bridge that? What is that journey for you, I guess, intellectually
yeah.
and
I mean, out of school, I actually started at, a major defense and, aerospace contractor, and, and when I had graduated from MIT at the time, I actually was very interested in doing a startup. So while I was at MIT, I remember I was an aerospace engineer, but I took some classes at the Sloan Business School on entrepreneurship and put together a business plan. And I learned that, I too could be a founder of a space startup if I can find at least $100 million to do it. Okay, so that was just a tea bit discouraging at the time, but it was the nature of the business. It's just a very expensive business to get into. So I did start off with one of the big contractors, and then I realized that really a lot of decisions. Oh, I should back up. It, um, the space shuttle had the Challenger accident back then, and we
mm,
lost. And the government had decided that instead of all satellites flying on the space shuttle, that ones that didn't need human astronauts on board, they would go to the private sector to do it. So at the company I was at, we actually had a rocket that was capable of taking satellites, and we said, let's enter the commercial market. It didn't go so well for us, and in part of my frustration is I saw that the government was making a lot of the critical decisions that
mm,
were shaping the market, whether it was the regulatory environment or the way they were giving out contracts that would sway how satellites were being designed and so on. So that's when I decided, got to work for the government. If I really want to understand what's going on, I want to work for the government. And you mentioned OMB, and the audience might not know OMB, but again, this is the part, like you said, the bean counters, but it's more than bean counters. It's actually, in my case, it was they brought in scientists and engineers in my group, and we'd work with NSF and NIH, and Department of Energy, and NASA, a lot of the agencies that were involved in science and tech. and we would help make resource decisions, like in the president's budget, how much should the president request
Yeah.
to do those things. So for me, that was
That's a
really
very
exciting.
anodyne way of saying it too. He says resource decisions. These are $50 billion decisions on American science and technologies. It's
Yes.
yeah. Sorry to interrupt you,
No,
but
no, you're right. And probably today it's over $100 billion. And you look at basic research applied and
yeah.
so on. And we were trying to make decisions. How do you allocate it? Would the Congress go along with it? And in my case, what made it so interesting is it wasn't just we were moving numbers around. It was like, who's doing the best research? Where are the areas of greatest promise? In fact,
Mhm.
one of the things just to share, I was very proud that I had a chance to work on it. It was under Vice President Gore. We had this high performance computing and
Yeah, yeah.
communication initiative. It was going to develop something that later became something called the internet. And another half of it was on supercomputers. And of course, me in my wisdom, I said, that network thing, I don't quite get it. But these supercomputers, yes, that's where we should play. So, anyways, that really allowed me to see the big picture of what's going on. So then when I went to a place like NASA afterwards, I really did have the benefit of having my head above the forest and be able to see these things.
Yeah. I mean, it was a curious time as well because I think NASA was still kind of I say this crudely, kind of the general contractor of space on behalf of the American people. And this may be an apocryphal story,
Okay.
but I have heard that while you were at NASA, you took one of the first meetings with this plucky startup called
We-
SpaceX, and they were pitching this crazy concept
Yeah.
of reusable rockets. Number one, is it true? And number two, if so, I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts about what your thoughts were at that time and thinking about
Mhm.
resources and risk and how that was going to interplay.
So even though I realized it was going to be very expensive to get into the business of and make a commercial going of this space exploration, I always had like an ongoing interest, and I had a chance. I always kept in touch with people that I thought were interesting. So this one gentleman calls me up and says, "Steve, I know you like talking to people that are doing interesting things, and 90% of the time it turns out to be nothing. But here's somebody who just might be interesting. I think he might be the real deal." And so Elon Musk and Gwen Shotwell, who is the
Huh?
president, came to see me, and Elon, said, "I can build a really inexpensive small rocket that's going to transform the market. So, and it's going to be so cheap that relative to the billions you're spending on the space shuttle, just write me a check." So
It was faster that
I
way.
said to him, like, literally, if it was up to me, I would pull out my checkbook and write it because the numbers were so small that it was like, why not? Why not do a little bit of portfolio effort here? But I said, unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. You've got to demonstrate you can build something that works because there's just too many people that just won't agree to something like this. And, to his credit, he went off, had a lot of failures, but then eventually did succeed with the small rocket. And, over time got the attention of the federal government. So yeah, it's a true story. But I would agree with the guy who introduced me. He did seem very different than the other ones I was meeting.
Yeah.
Very determined and incredibly smart.
It's interesting to think about kind of those weird moments where there's
Yeah.
this like unspoken thing, but you can, I guess, feel it when you're talking to a young founder or something. And there's, yeah, that X factor that comes out.
Yeah.
SpaceX and many of these other commercial space companies that are coming up, Blue Origin, there's like Rocket Labs, there's all these cool companies that are
Mhm.
doing remarkable things. What I've seen is that there is just a sea change in sort of the risk appetite
Yeah.
with respect to space. And one of my earliest memories is the Challenger accident,
Yeah.
actually, and so that stands out as sort of something that ties space in my head, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But over time, what we've seen with these commercial entities that have received a lot of private capital, there is this just difference in tolerance for failure and repeated failure. What do you make of that? I mean, especially because you sit at that intersection
Yeah.
between commercial and government.
Yeah. In some ways, the time we're living in now is a little bit back to the future. I mean, one of the things I also thought was pretty cool as a kid is when I used to see these old films of rockets just blowing up left and right. If you looked at the US in the 50s and 60s, it was not very good. I mean, it's, how these spinning rockets and they would blow up and, it was, even when we flew the very first astronauts, there was like a
Mm.
10 or 20% chance that the rocket they were going to go on was going to blow up. I mean, today it's got to be less than 1% for even to consider it. So that was sort of crazy. So the government was very forward leaning and taking risks, knowing that people could die as a result, building multiple versions of a rocket, saying, okay, that one didn't work. 2 weeks later, they'd roll out another one and try again. And, the first 9 out of 10 would fail. Congress wouldn't terminate them. The press wouldn't be bad on them. They would sort of keep going and being able to, and that's why it's astounding to think about it that, Kennedy announced we're going to the moon and we hadn't actually really even successfully gotten to Earth orbit. And he's saying we're going to the moon. And by the way, we're doing
And
it
we're
by
gonna
the end
come
of the
back.
decade. Yeah, and we're going to bring them back too. That is just like amazing. And, we did not have modern computers. In fact, one of NASA's greatest achievements is actually helped encourage the original miniaturization of the computer to make it happen. That was the government then. Now we live in a very different time. Hyper media coverage, Congress can be very critical of it. The incentive systems in the government have sort of changed where if you succeed, good job. But if you fail, it's game over, career done. And so it's very risk averse. So to your question, I think now then we saw these new companies coming into the forefront. And what enabled them, going back to my MIT story, is it was no longer, I need $100 million to do it. They started to introduce newer technologies that were changing the economics. So the satellites we buy today, we could launch them to orbit on a per pound basis for 1/10 the cost
Right.
that we were doing, just 10, 15 years ago. I mean, that's an incredible change. We used to go from these bus-sized satellites to ones that I can carry in my hand. They can do incredible amount of capability and research and do them in high numbers. So the economics have changed. So I think between the costs going down, you've got these young bucks that are out there trying to go after these things, and it doesn't hurt you have some billionaires who said, I'll play big on this stuff. I don't care if I'm not getting a return for a while. It has really opened up the frontier. So I think we're finding the private sector has sort of played the role that the government has done, and the government's trying to figure out how to tap into it.
It's interesting you're talking about how during the rocket program, they were able to turn around new build outs every couple weeks.
Yeah.
I don't know that that would be like my immediate thought for how long it would take to rebuild a rocket with today's sort of structure of things. So I think the sort of traditional government contractor
Yeah.
presumption is that they cannot move and iterate that
Yep.
quickly. With these kind of private, non-traditional
Mhm.
contractors, are you seeing this like fast iterative cycling being a big part of their success and likewise the government's interest in working with them?
Yeah, I think the government's interested in a couple things. One is their willingness to accept more risk
Mhm.
and to do it on their nickel, which is the key. They're willing to put enough money up front that they're sort of buying down the development costs. The government is so used to having to pay for all the risk involved, these so-called cost plus contracts where you cover your costs, plus you get a fee on top of it. If you have an overrun, you're still, you're not going to lose money as a result. It was always assumed that tech was so hard that only the government can do it. So that was sort of the reason for it. Now here comes these new companies who saying, I don't think it's that hard. I think we can do it. I'm willing to invest hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of dollars to develop new drones, new rockets, new satellites, new sensors, new ground systems. That has gotten the government saying, wait a minute, this is kind of interesting. Now we're still in this early phase, which is, all right, you're still not going to do a commercial startup that's going to build the Webb telescope or the Hubble Space Telescope. Okay. But there still is a class of sort of technologies and applications where they do fit in. The second thing is there's a little bit of discussion in the industry that said it always been sort of hardware first. It's all about the hardware that we're building. Now you have these companies with more of a Silicon Valley kind of mindset, and they're like, nah, it's the software first. The hardware is becoming increasingly commoditized, and I
Mhm.
could buy that, and maybe it's still hard, but it's not as hard. The hardest problem is how to get everything to work together. And so you get these companies like Anduril and Palantir and so on that are sort of coming at it with this sort of software first approach and trying to come up with these capabilities. And that's what's kind of the interesting tussle right now. You got these traditional sort of hardware first companies, cost plus, versus more of these fixed price or services companies that are putting their own nickel that are kind of software first. We'll see how that plays out.
Well, I think it's interesting because you all, as Aerospace
Yeah.
Corp, again, you seem to play kind of an interface here on
Mm,
behalf of the government. Can you explain a little bit about
sure.
what it is that y'all do on behalf of the government, but
Yeah.
you're working with commercial entities and you're bringing these technologies into the fold?
Yeah. Yeah. I should spend a minute. In fact, I was listening to your introduction. I bet you half the audience is like, wait, what do they do? First of all, we are called the Aerospace Corporation, which I realize is probably the most dull name you could think of. But we were one of the first companies in the industry. So hence we got this kind of less than exciting name. I thought maybe we should just pronounce our name different, like Aerospace or something, just to give it a little more zip.
But you got the URL, so
Yeah.
that's the most important.
Um, but we're a nonprofit and we're kind of a unique entity. The government in the 50s and 60s realized there are certain technologies that are so important to the health of the United States that we can't depend just solely on the for profit private sector to ensure that things are going to come along. And if we just use civil servants and the usual federal labs, not sure we can pay the kind of prevailing wages needed to attract the talent. So we created these private nonprofits, and examples would be like NASA JPL. It's the same thing like us. It's a federally funded R&D center. They're responsible for planetary science. Commercial. Landing on Mars still right now is not a commercial activity. Los Alamos in charge of the nuclear warheads that are being built and so on. Again, not a very commercial activity. You need nuclear scientists. We were created to make connections across the space industry, that there is a class of research that companies wouldn't naturally go into, but are really hard for us to enable to do it. So we don't compete with industry, and that is actually our superpower. Because we don't compete with industry, and we are a close partner of the government, industry is comfortable to come to us with their hard problems, and we're able to sort of see across the industry in a way that others can't. So, just a quick example: if someone's satellite breaks because they have a supplier that has given us a part that doesn't work, they don't want to tell anybody. They don't want to admit what broke on it. They'll share that with us, and we're able to share it with the rest of the industry in a way that they're sort of protected on the proprietary side. But now industry knows, be careful about this part before you all start putting on all your satellites, and have a problem. So we become sort of a trusted partner with them. And the government knows that since we're not competing with industry, they bring us in the room for a lot of really important decisions and help with some really, really hard decisions as we go forward. So, and we cut across we probably do more things across America's space program than even the federal government does, because we do civil, national security, and commercial related activities.
It's a incredible span. Is that,
Yeah.
was that the Space 911? Is that what it's called? Or is that just y'all's shorthand for it?
Yeah, some people refer to it as a Space 911. Like if you got something that you just can't figure out, and we've had some really hard problems to deal with. The astronauts they just brought back down, and they're just trying to figure out will this thing work. They'll often call us in to
Okay.
go after problems that others can't solve.
Call Space 911 first.
Space
Yeah.
911.
This must mean as well that your team is just fully I mean, there's what, 1,500, give or take, commercial space companies out there today, something like that. How is your team just on top of it and basically searching the earth for new technologies and
Mhm.
working with the technologists on in those companies? Like, what does that interaction look like?
Yeah, most of the work we do is for the government, and the government tends to be on sort of the leading edge of going after really hard problems. We want to send astronauts to the moon. We want them to stay long term. We want satellites to have GPS precision beyond those and resilient so that they're not, jammed as they go forward. The government tends to pose these really hard problems. So we try to take that and put it in engineering language in terms of like what needs to be done. Now, to solve those problems, we obviously need to be kept abreast of who's working these kinds of problems, who has the leading edge of capability, as we go forward. So naturally, in our work for the government, it incentivizes us to have this close working relationship with industry.
Are you all, for example, identifying a company that has a technology? Let's use what comes after GPS as an
Right.
example. That is a big issue, a national
Yeah.
security issue for the government. So are you all saying, okay, I've identified company A has a very interesting positioning and navigation and timing technology that we've never seen before. Let's go talk to them. Maybe let's do a project
Yeah.
with them. Or is it, I know they're
Mm.
there, and I know the government wants to do this project, so we'll just
All right.
connect them.
Yeah, in fact, we have something within our company called Commercial Space Futures, which is constantly trying to look for what's out in industry to find things where maybe no one else is looking. And it's not just space related, sometimes it's non-space companies that are some of the most interesting. Second, to say, is it real? Does it defy physics? Okay, there's a lot of those that are out
Critical
there.
question.
And then third, we try to see how well it applies and other things we can do to accelerate it. You mentioned GPS. GPS is an interesting example. At Aerospace, we were actually one of the co-inventors of GPS, working with the Air Force on a military application. At the time, it was just focused on the Vietnam War, and bunch of smart engineers said, we could design this in a way that allows it to be scaled at a global level, so it could be applied anywhere. So it's the GPS that we all celebrate today. But the GPS has its issues,
Mhm.
and particularly from a national security side. Good luck trying to use GPS if you're anywhere near Ukraine, and good luck trying to use GPS if you're in the Middle East during times of heated conflict. And frankly, you could run into issues in GPS just by simple jamming that happens at Newark Airport and so on. So there's a lot of concern today, the ease at which one can jam signals out of GPS. So we're very focused on something called resilient GPS, which is to try to find ways, whether it's the GPS satellites themselves or through other satellites and other means to get other signals in there. So, in fact, you could have the kind of services that you need even during a time of crisis. And by the way, our adversaries know this, right? So that's why when I mention Ukraine, I mean, the first thing an adversary does is they'll jam GPS, because they saw what happened in the Iraq War, that these smart weapons were using all the GPS technology. So, and then today, if they can jam GPS, then the drones are going to have a hard time sort
Mhm.
of finding their way around. And then again, it's just mischief that people get into that can block. These signals are actually quite weak. It doesn't take much to actually block a GPS signal. So a lot of the focus today in national security is on this word resilience, which is to know that it's not just a single string, it's not just a single bad actor, it's not just one missile against your
Mm.
satellite that would take you out. And that's where I think commercial has gotten much more interesting. So how do we take advantage of what's commercially occurring, or we can incentivize commercially to occur that would complement what the government owns and operates?
I think a lot about integrating commercial technologies into these challenging
Mhm.
domains like national security. And oftentimes, I think the biggest resistance that has existed previously was concerns around cybersecurity and
Mhm.
trust in the hardware. As we're seeing, unfortunately, in Ukraine,
Mhm.
this is kind of famously referred to as the first commercial war. So we're seeing that
Mhm.
these like low cost platforms are being treated in an almost disposable manner, and maybe
Mhm.
some of these security concerns can be, I don't know, decreased? Is that a calculus that's coming into the development of kind of these next gen technologies because these costs are coming down so rapidly around communications and space
Right.
and sending up different types of payloads and things?
I mean, one of the things that's sort of changed warfare is what they call these asymmetric technologies. If I can send a $20,000 drone to take out a tank that cost me $3 million, that changes everything. If the Houthis can tie up the entire Red Sea just by flying these cheap things and causing the whole world to have to sail around that, that's pretty game changing. When you see the Russians, they don't move their tanks out anymore and so on because of the fact there's so many of these drones, overhead. Missile technology has gotten, again, also relatively more capable and also maybe less expensive. So that's why you're seeing sort of modern wars like in the Middle East between Iran and Israel are
Mm.
not tanks and soldiers. These are missiles, cruise missiles, drones that they're firing at each other. That has really changed the nature of warfare. And the concern is as a nation, we still build these very exquisite platforms. So yeah, the Houthis will fire a drone and we'll fire a $1 million missile and take it out. But after a while, that costs a fair bit, and you're going to lose on the economics of that. And so the question is, how do you begin to develop, similar kinds of technologies? So that's why you've heard programs in the past, one that was like, for example, called Replicator, but the idea was to swarm your enemies with so many drones that are highly controlled that it's going to be, overwhelming. Or like last week, they just announced a huge tens of billion-dollar contract with Boeing for the F-37, the next generation of a fighter jet. But one of the big debates before they would make that award is is human flown piloted aircraft. Does it still make sense in modern warfare, or should it be these uncrewed platforms? So what they've come out with is they more these sort of become collaborative designs where you have the human piloted plane followed by a whole squadron of these uncrewed vehicles
Okay.
that the pilot in the plane is giving the command, take that there, go over there. It's too dangerous for me because there's too many aircraft missiles. But for you, you're inexpensive. Go there and swarm and take it out. So these kind of technologies are really, I think, a significant pull for the private sector. Now, you made one comment that is really important, and this is part of the skepticism. So even though the private sector might be really smart in producing something, but can it do well in the combat environment? So there have been stories, for example, that Silicon Valley companies said, "Oh, we can make great drones. We'll sell it to the Ukrainians," and they have not performed well because they have not built these things in the environment that they're now being flown. Ukrainians, on the other hand, not nearly as sophisticated as we are building some of the most state-of-the-art drones because they are iterating every few weeks. They're making an improvement. The Russians try to counter it. They come up with a new design. You can't get to GPS, then you do ground mapping. And so it's really interesting to watch. And you called it the first commercial war. Actually, I heard somebody say that, but now that you say that, it was spot on. I mean, the first thing the Russians did is they had a cyber attack on all the communication satellites, figuring that will disrupt the Ukrainians. But then there's this thing called Starlink. It had a very different kind of design as it went forward, and it's very difficult to jam. And so that had been the early lifeblood of the Ukrainians. And again, very much a commercial thing. And so while we're trying to figure out how to get them what they needed to survive the initial attack, they had these commercial, antennas that they're able to put up. So it's really interesting.
I had no idea that this juxtaposition between sort of the Silicon Valley deployed drones versus the
Yeah.
locally made ones. It's cool to think about that. Cool is maybe not the correct way to describe it, but they are sitting in the perfect test bed, and they are like any startup out there having to test and experiment and
Yeah.
learn and rebuild, and it's happening at a pace that's hard to imagine because the urgency is so great.
Their lives depend on it.
Their lives depend on it, and when we look at maybe the evolution of space technology, even in the US, the early days of the space program were, again, rooted in this existential threat
Yes.
and led to some very rapid step change innovations. As this concept of commercial space starts to expand, largely right now, even if you look at contracts that are being written for, big satellite companies, Maxar, Planet Labs, whatever, they're getting hundreds of millions of dollars, billion-dollar contracts. Those are still largely government contracts, National Reconnaissance Office, Air Force, etc. That is still the government as the customer, and it's because there is still urgent need and a national security imperative. I'm trying to envision, how do these commercial space tech companies start to invert their economics away from just a significant dependence on government funding, and government as the
Yeah.
customer. I mean, we see now that the Bears and the Syngentas of the world, the hedge funds are buying up data. Data from space is so valuable, but it's still kind of a drop in the bucket, I think. Do you think real commercial space, like space as a commercial sector, is going to be real? And if so, is it here, or when do you think that's going to become real?
It absolutely is a real thing. I mean, just going back, I mentioned Starlink. They make a good amount of money from federal contracts and what's happening overseas, but that's the vast majority is a truly commercial application. You got Amazon that is just getting ready to launch their own constellation of satellites called Kuiper, where they're also going to be putting up thousands of satellites to compete against Starlink for not only perhaps their own Amazon needs, but for the growth in the market. There's this international effort called OneWeb, where again, hundreds of satellites that are currently up there that are out there competing for it. There's these new applications called direct to device, which is the ability for to have communications directly to your cell phone. So, if you will, they're like cell towers in space
Okay.
that are just now being introduced. Right now, it's kind of rudimentary. Apple did it in their latest phones, where essentially you could be anywhere in the world, on top of the mountain tops, anywhere, and you could hit a 911, and your signal will be sent. Now it's evolving to text. Eventually, it's going to be voice. Eventually, it's going to be video, and I think that's going to be very game changing as it goes on. So your point's still taken. I do think it's a big market. It's a real market. I think communications is the market has the most clear, particularly with the Internet of Things as it's going around the world. There's areas of Earth observation, which is when it's clearly more dominated, by the government. Weather satellites are essentially paid for by the government, so it's
Yeah.
considered a free service at this point. But people are looking at sort of value added things that, like, maybe farmers can better predict their crop yields. That an oil exploration, you can maybe get some competitive information just by observing things that are across the world. A lot of things we see in the newspapers today are as a result of these commercial companies that are selling these views on it. And then there's even these newer markets that are opening up, which is, I wouldn't have thought it, but it's called space surveillance, which is the ability for satellites to watch other satellites. It's actually, it sounds crazy, and I sort of joke when I'm in LA. LA is not the only place with traffic jams. You actually have traffic issues now in space. Satellites that are getting too close to each other, they got to move away from each other. We have issues of orbital debris. 'Cause the problem with space, as opposed to the atmosphere, if something breaks up in the atmosphere, right?
Yeah.
The atmosphere will bring it down and it'll crash into the ground. In space, something breaks up, it just stays there and it accumulates. And after a while, it becomes a real problem. And we're now today, actually, we launch our rockets. We got to sometimes wait for things to pass over before we can launch things up. So there's some commercial companies that are looking at that, or the commercial companies that are looking to refuel satellites, to enhance satellites, maybe to move them around into different orbits, as they go forward. So I think there's some really interesting markets about to open up.
If you're a startup today that's thinking about going into space and maybe has designs on both government as a customer, but as well some kind of
Uh,
commercial opportunities, where do you think they need to aim first? Should they be looking to the government as a first customer? Or is that still like the best first place to land? Or do you think that a young startup that, like maybe that you were dreaming of when
yeah,
you were coming out of college, can they make a go of it as a kind of a pure play commercial entity?
yeah. So there's some trade-offs they're going to have to consider. The upsides of the government is you have non-dilutive funds. They're giving you a grant or saying, "Here's some money. I'm not taking any equity away
Mhm.
from you." I mean, boy, that's super attractive. And at the end of the day, they're not like leaning over you, particularly in some of these early grants that they give you, small business, innovative research
Mhm.
types of activities. The huge downside is those things only open up when they open up. You got to submit a proposal, you got to wait on it. It might get caught up in some bureaucratic morass. And so
Yeah.
you're not going to move particularly fast in that environment. So I preferred, if you can do private financing at the front end, move fast, get a product, and then use the government to say, all right, I'm ready now to scale it up. I've demonstrated it at some level. Like, if I can use government funds to sort of bring it into the government market, that's a pretty good way actually to do it. And that's when I think you can get in some of the more interesting trade-offs between the government and trying to finance it yourself. When I was at Virgin, I did not want to do actually anything with the government, which is weird because I was a government guy with a lot of experience. But
You
it's
knew too
because
much.
that I
That was
knew
the
too
reason.
much. So just things like cost accounting rules and all these things that once you sign a contract with the government, it comes with all these, and you got to start hiring a bunch of people to do it. So that's why some companies just say, I as attractive as a cost plus contract would be, it is not worth it. It's not worth all the overhead associated with that. So it's just going to be a service, maybe a fixed price contract that has less burden on it. There are some companies out there that just say, They will draw the line because they realize it will actually change the culture and the kind of company they are, and they will not be able to move nearly as fast if they buy into the cost plus. And the government realizes that. But the trouble with the government is, the other thing the government doesn't want to do is, if I give you a fixed price contract and then halfway through you say, "This is harder than I thought. I'm out." I said, so what does the government do then at that point? Like, I really needed that thing. I was depending on that
Yeah.
thing, and now you're not gonna be able to deliver on it. So I guess I'm gonna have to pay you more to keep that thing going, or terminate it. But paying you more for it again, now it's like sort of defeating the purpose. It's sort of cost plus without you having the burden on it. And I think that's the fear on the government side is, will this entity see it through? Will you really be viable 3 years from now, or is
Right.
you're depending on a lot more fundraise in a market that's in some question? That's the trade-off from the government
Okay.
side.
Yeah. Go commercial is the lesson here.
I think if you want to move fastest, yes.
Absolutely. I think and that's yeah, speed is survival in startup world too. So, I would love to maybe take a minute to talk about just the future.
I love talking about the future because I
Y
can't be wrong, right? I mean,
What about that internet thing though?
oh yeah, okay, well, you're listening to me.
If I found a random engineer at Aerospace
Uh-huh.
and I asked them, "What is the coolest thing that you're working on that
Mm,
maybe your family has no idea that you're working on
yeah.
this?" Like, can you give us some broad strokes of what that might be and that gets people excited to show up every day and do this hard mission?
Oh god, there's so many things that are going on right now. I mean, one that just has me excited talking to the engineers is the notion of super intelligent satellites that don't need human operators on the ground. Right now, most of the satellites we launch are kind of dumb cameras. They're sort of like, I'm going to turn the camera on, and whatever comes in view, I'll just send that relay to the ground, and human operators will look at it and figure out if there's something interesting. But if really all I want to look at is, I don't know, aircraft carriers and a certain part of the world, and tell the satellite that's all I want to, just give me naval ships. Don't give me every ship that crosses. And by the way, it'd be great to have a satellite that says, I don't feel so good. Like this is not, one of my components is starting to feel like it's a little bit worn out. It's
Call
feeling a little
Space
hotter than
911 for
usual.
me, please.
And by the way, because I'm concerned about that, I know I have some satellites in the neighborhood.
Huh.
I'm going to start using them to relay some of my information. And if I should go down, I'm going to have them adjust to fill in for me because we can communicate with each other and we're highly interoperable as we go forward. I think that's like super cool.
Yeah.
And so I recently gave a talk to a conference where I took a clip from a Star Trek movie where they had the Enterprise was moving in to do battle with a swarm of these small, super intelligent satellites. And it did not end well for the Enterprise. They just got overwhelmed by the numbers. I think that's the future we're headed at. It's just an overwhelming number of super intelligent satellites that can do multi-purpose things, that can adjust, take care of themselves, and really reduce the workload, on the ground.
So we're trying to
Are you
do
excited by that?
I'm terrified by that. Mostly the concept of anything being super intelligent. No, but
By the way,
no,
this is how the movie Skynet got
yeah,
started.
yeah.
So I'm sure
I
people
saw
are
how that
thinking
movie
yeah,
ends.
yeah.
No, I think it's actually, as a concept, it is extremely interesting because, in part because I can just imagine, even just off the top of my head, a handful of very meaty technical problems to make that become a reality. What do you see as maybe number one, like the biggest enabler for getting to that vision? And then number two, maybe the biggest hurdle that still remains in terms of attaining this kind of uh, super intelligent Skynet situation.
Yeah, so you can say, well, why can't we do it today? I mean, we got these NVIDIA GPUs. We can't we just put a bunch of them up there in space? But the problem in space is an incredibly harsh environment. You got temperatures at extreme levels. You got radiation environments. You got corona events coming off the sun that just sort of fry electronics. You've got the Van Allen belt, which is a very intense radiation environment that satellites have to fly through. So satellites to date have had these sort of radiation hardened special environmental testing. They're very non-commercial in their design. They're very expensive because foundries don't like to, just give you 10,000 of these things. If you're not ordering in the millions, then
Yeah.
You're sort of wasting my time. We have to test these things to death to make sure we test them on the ground before we put them into space. We don't want them to break ahead of time. So it's a very intensive operation. I think we're trying to move towards a future where we could maybe find ways to maybe build these kinds of custom built chips, or better yet, maybe even find a way if the cost of launch continues to drop, maybe you just shield it, put enough lead and other things around these things that would protect these boxes from doing it. We haven't done that in the past because it's so expensive,
Yeah.
the cost of getting into space. But I mentioned the 10x or the 90% drop in the cost of getting into space. It could be another 90% for some of the things we're looking at in the future with some of these new launch vehicles that are coming online. That I think will also enable us to start thinking differently on what we build. Because right now, a lot of satellites, rockets we build, they're kind of tight to fit into. So you have to kind of scrunch them in. The satellite gets deployed and then it opens up, it deploys and opens up its antennas and so on. And it's incredibly complicated, and a lot of satellites don't do well. In fact, the Webb telescope, that was the hardest part of it,
Mhm.
is just getting this umbrella to open up to an incredible accuracy. But what if I told you we're building rockets that are so big you don't need to scrunch up? You can just build it to be full sized in terms of its deployment. Now you can start thinking very differently in the kind of optics that you're putting up and the kind of antennas you're putting up and the kind of power you're putting up in space. That to me is pretty game changing. I think that's the world we're heading into. So between microelectronic improvements I see, as well as launch vehicles that allow for these larger structures, I think that's going to enable that super intelligence.
Okay. Okay, I have one last question for you. If you could be the founder of a space startup today,
Oh. Okay.
what would that company be doing? And let's just pretend I got $100 million check for you. It just if we want to make this an easier thought exercise.
Yeah. We sort of say at the Aerospace Corporation that grounds the new space. That, as we put up these, very intelligent satellites that are capable of, collecting vast amounts of data, the challenge has been sort of as they come to the ground, what do we do with it? How do we process it? How do we get it to the end user in a way that it's in its most useful form?
Mhm.
I still think it's sort of early days in terms of the possibilities of what we can be doing, with a lot of those kind of capabilities. I think a lot of non-space companies are finding interest in these kind of applications in terms of our way to do things on the ground. We've gone through almost a whole discussion without mentioning AI, so I don't want to end that streak, so I got to mention it here. But again, I think AI really can be very transformative in terms of how we deal with this vast amounts of data. The amount of data we bring down now is just really it's overwhelming, and to actually have something in there that's intelligent enough, whether it's the AI on orbit or AI on the ground or AI in the drone or AI just
Just
assisting the
AI.
operator,
Yeah.
it's going to be pretty much in everything we're going to be touching, going forward.
So it sounds like you want to start an AI for space data company, maybe.
I think so, as long as, but the key to it, again, I think the key is the AI. You've got to have access to the data. You've got to find yourself in that unique place.
Yeah.
So at Aerospace Corporation, we've been around 60 years. We have a lot of data. Now you can say, "Oh my God, you're like the treasure trove." It's like, you could just put the ultimate chat GPT over all that data you have and you can answer anything. The struggle that we have is a lot of the data is classified. It's by different services that have their own rules. A lot of it is proprietary. So how do you get to a place where you could somehow learn from the information that's out there, but without in a way that's compromising critically sensitive information? So if someone could come up with the kind of tools that allow us to operate in that kind of heterogeneous data
Yeah.
world, I think that would be really powerful.
Interoperability up in space,
Hey,
on the
ground.
ground, and within the kind of data domain is, yeah,
Yeah,
huge,
yeah, I
huge
think it's
issue.
exciting. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think what we're gonna do is leave it at that as a big challenge out to the world. Please solve this problem. And
You didn't ask me a question I thought people always
oh,
ask me in these interviews. Is there intelligent life elsewhere? And why haven't you told us by now?
Oh, I guess I didn't
You
feel
didn't?
like that was a question because we know that there is.
Oh, we do.
Yeah, sorry. But I would love to hear what data you have on that.
You really expect me to tell you? For those that made it here today, I will tell you after we go off the air. And for those of you who didn't attend in person, well, you're going to have to find out some.
You're out of luck. We're going to talk about we're going to
Okay.
talk about intelligent beings in the rest of
Yeah,
space
walk among us.
at our reception after this. Before that, I do want to ask the audience, everybody here, please let's give Steve a round of applause. Thank you so much for
Thank
taking
you.
the time today
Wonderful.
to speak with us. And tune in next time for the next SOSV Deep Tech Live. And thank you for being with us tonight.